Every now and then, you just have to give the devil his due. Every now and then, you have to admit when the competitor did it better than you did. Gobots gets a reputation for being a cheap knockoff of the Transformers, and a lot of people historically remember them that way, even though that is not at all accurate to how everything went down. So, rather than give you a long-running history lesson of the Gobots versus the Transformers, we'll do that later on. Today we're going to be focusing on the positives and actually let you know that Gobots was a better competitor back in the day than you may have realized, because there are several things they did a lot better. So today we're going to look at 10 ways that Gobots were actually better than Transformers. And to start with, we're going to be talking about an area that Gobots hit on that Transformers just never figured out, and that is vehicular toys. And I don't mean literal, like they are vehicles. Of course, Transformers had that. What I mean is the play pattern of the 80s revolved around largely a lot of vehicle toys. You know, this is the era of the Star Wars toys where you had X-Wings, Millennium Falcons, TIE Fighters, etc. Kids liked having those big vehicles for their characters to ride in. Transformers never really did anything like this. You didn't get anything vehicle-wise until like Beast Machines and your chariot things that no one knew what to do with and was never a good idea. And properly, you didn't really even get it until they did the original Cyberverse and Dark of the Moon. Gobots had it from the start, whether it was the power suits that let you armor up your original classic Gobots, or if it was the command center and thruster base figures that, it's rather than a big Metroplex or something, you had a vehicle that the Gobots could ride in, and then opens up into the base itself, and had a little bit of a robot aesthetic to it itself. It's a play pattern that Transformers just never quite figured out. They eventually got some kind of playset functionality with the City Formers, of course, but it really wasn't, comparable to what other action figure lines did. Gobots had it figured out from the start, though. Next up, I want you to take a look at all the alternate modes that Gobots went through and actually realize just how much more variety there was compared to Transformers. Transformers really likes its general areas. When you're looking at a plane, for instance, in Transformers, it's almost always some kind of fighter jet, especially in G1. From the Seekers to the aerial bots, you really only had Power Glide as any kind of variation to your jets. Even Jetfire was just a really big, fighter jet with, that booster pack on the back. And they stuck with sports cars for the most part. You look at Gobots, and you're looking at things like a scooter, a forklift, submarine, luxury cars, seaplane. I had the seaplane as a kid, and it was actually kind of a cool little figure. Overall, if you look at the variety, they went with common cars as well as luxury cars as well as sports cars. They had fighter jets, but they also had a lot of different variations on the types of planes that they used. And they touched on vehicle modes that, to this day, Transformers has never done. We didn't get a scooter until Armada in Transformers. You look how long it took to get a submarine. Like, we didn't have a submarine transformer in Transformers until Classics. It was Cybertron. It was the last wave Cybertron Minicon set. It was that long, and we still don't have a proper submarine. So there you go. There's a lot, compared to what Transformers was doing back in the day. Yes, they both had variety in their own ways, but if you take a look at the different types of jets, cars, and vehicles Transformers never even considered, to this day hasn't considered, it's actually pretty impressive. This next one is Nature of the Beast, but it's definitely worth talking about. It is definitely a big difference between the two, and that is design consistency. Machine Robo was just one single toy line in Japan that was imported into America to create the Gobots. Whereas Transformers, as we recently talked about, was 11 different toy lines in Japan coming together into one. That meant the aesthetic was generally all over the place, especially as Hasbro kind of struggled to meet demand for the US market and started licensing toys from all over the place. Omega Supreme looks nothing like any other Transformer. Shockwave looks very different. Whirl looks very different. Even amongst early G1, of course, a figure like Ironhide looks very different from a Sideswipe. Gobots had consistency. Because it was all one toy line, everyone kind of looked like they fit in regardless of the size. They did have their oddities. They did have their own, like, if you want to make your Shockwave comparable, you had things like Psycho and Destroyer that had these, like, big dome-shaped heads, rather than your standard robots. But, again, that, a bit of variety is not really that bad. And, of course, they still had the other aesthetics that did match the Gobots in general. When you line up a line of Gobots on a table, no matter how many it is, it all looks like they belong together. There's some variation, but for the most part, it looks like the same toy line. Whereas Transformers, especially if you go through the first 3 years, you can definitely see where the divide is between the different aesthetics. So for design consistency, figures that all match each other, Gobots had them beat. We're going to credit the cartoon for this one, but it does play into the play pattern as a whole. One of the weirdest things when you were collecting Transformers as a kid was just how different in size everyone was. You were watching the cartoon, and Ironhide is one of the taller Autobots, and then you buy the Ironhide toy, and the robot mode is barely taller than the Mini-Bots. You buy a Blaster who's towering over every other Autobot in the lineup. He's as big as a Combiner. The design, because the toys came from all over the place, the design consistency was all over the map. You had toys wildly out of scale with each other no matter how they were depicted in the cartoon. Even amongst your toy selections, it didn't make sense why a van was turning into a robot barely any taller than a Volkswagen Beetle. With Gobots, everyone was basically the same. Scooter and Leader 1 were the same size, even though one turned into, obviously a scooter, and a jet. Everyone in the show was kind of in that same scale, because in the toy line, mostly everyone was in the same scale, outside of the Super Gobots, which, are depicted as bigger. So, it made more sense. As a kid, looking at these, it felt more like the characters in the show because it looked correct. If I line up my cast of Autobots versus Decepticons, it's going to look way different than it did in the show. And that's, nature of the beast there. But with the Gobots, it all looked right. I could imagine the scenes in the show happening on my table, and that made them really cool. Look again at the variety of vehicles that Gobots went with, and you're going to notice something else. Transformers, from day one, depended on repaints in order to fill out the line. It's how we got the Seekers. It's how we got Ratchet. It's how we got Blue Streak. Gobots didn't need to do that. Again, this comes from the fact that Machine Robo had so many more toys all ready to go. But it really spells it out when you start looking through transformersland.com, and of course thank you to them for any photos I'm showing. I'm trying to link them all. I'm trying to put the link on all of the photos, because guess what? There's very few places that have really good photos of these things. But if you start looking through all of these different listings and seeing a whole batch of different Gobots at once, you're going to notice almost no repaints. The main characters like Psykill, Crasher, Leader 1, you're going to find little repaints of them here and there, but for the most part, almost the entire toy line were distinct molds and different characters. You had very, very little dependency on repaints of any kind, whereas Transformers has always done that to bulk out its toy line. Gobots never had to resort to that. You always had more variety. You always had more options to pick from. That is a huge thing, especially when it's the parents buying it, pointing at that and going, you've already got that jet. You can't get that jet again. It's the same jet. I got that too. I wasn't able to get that black and gold Megazord as a kid because I already had the main Megazord. Now that black and gold is worth a fortune. Not that, Not to saying like GoBots are going to be like, like tremendously expensive here, but it was important back then that everything was different because it gave you more to pick from, and it meant you usually got them more often than you did repainted Transformers. So yeah, it's actually a really cool thing that there was so little redundancy in that toy line. Today we talk about Transformers' lack of bravery in what they do, and that's something GoBots was doing from the beginning. These days, and even back then, Transformers kind of had its own little niches that it didn't leave. It did a lot of sports cars because sports cars are cool. It did a lot of fighter jets. And then when they had to start reinventing, they never really went too far out of that overall range. Okay, the head turns into a little robot, but you're still making futuristic cars like you did the previous year. Okay, well now they have little shells that they can go around, but you're still making futuristic cars and vehicles that you were making the previous years. GoBots, on the other hand, was a little bit more daring with what they were doing. Not only the vehicle variety, but take a look at how early they introduced alien vehicles to the toy line in order to create some variety. And not only the alien vehicles, but the alien robot modes. You look at something like Pincher, for instance, and he still comes across as GoBot, but man, he's so different from everybody else. He actually creates this really cool aesthetic within GoBots themselves. And GoBots were more willing to take a risk like that, talking of risks, the Rock Lords as the spinoff. You don't get much riskier than that. I don't know, okay, so we can admit GoBots didn't work, but it was brave to try. Let's give them credit for that. Overall, I felt like GoBots was more willing to do things differently than Transformers was. Even today, we kind of struggled to get Hasbro to do anything differently, especially now that we're dependent on nostalgia for new toys. Back then, of course, that wasn't an issue, but they still were stuck in their ways and kind of still stuck in their own little niches. Even across all the different toy lines they were buying from, there isn't too much out of the way. The occasional Insecticon, for instance. GoBots was willing to do more. That's all I'm saying here. And I actually really appreciated them for that. GoBots wasn't really a line that focused on its gimmicks, but when they had them, wow, they were actually fairly impressive. So this extends to a lot of different GoBot toys, whether it was the stuff that was built into the line or stuff that was a sub-series. A lot of gimmicky GoBot toys were actually sub-series that were separate from the main toy lines. You had things like, their answer to Megatron was working squirt guns and cap guns that transformed. Simplistic transformations nonetheless, but they did do them, which actually kind of cool. But within the toy line, when they did gimmicks, hoo boy, they actually pull it off pretty impressively. You take a look at the Dread launchers and realize that that's the Duocon gimmick, except the toys have better interplay in between the two alternate vehicle modes. The combination on them is, essentially the same, but you ended up getting a lot more articulation out of them. And overall, they were just better toys than the Duocons, which I rank as some of the worst G1 toys. And then you look at something like Puzzler, and you look at Puzzler and go, wow, that's a weird-looking robot for a combiner. But you understand, not only do the 6 individual figures that make up those characters look fine, they look like they belong in the GoBots without any issue. It doesn't seem like they sacrifice compared to anything else in the toy line. They're completely built in. That's the impressive part to Puzzler. There is no additional parts. You look at the original combiner for Transformers and Devastator. Hands, forearms, head, pelvis piece, all of that had to be attached on. And then you also had the chest and pelvis armor that had to be separate pieces that were put on later. Puzzler didn't need any of that. It was 6 figures that combined. Hands and feet were built in. Combiner head was built in. Transformers didn't even try that until Liokaiser, and even then it still needed a separate helmet. We didn't get fully integrated combiners until Beast Wars. GoBots was doing it from day one. Well, not day one, it came out later, but you get my point. It was done better. That's all I'm saying. Puzzler might have a unique aesthetic to him compared to like how we think of combiners with Transformers, but back in the day, it stood out. And back in the day, it meant you could have a combiner without losing your combination ability because you misplaced the pelvis or, the forearm hinge broke. Again, Puzzler just did it better. Another thing the cartoon did that affected the toy line was female representation, which Transformers is still kind of struggling with. Here we are trying to figure out how to make a decent RC figure when Gobots had it down pretty much from the beginning. You look at those characters and they're just female. Like they aren't treated any differently than the male cast. They aren't given these like faux sexy designs so people can draw lewd art of them. Though I'm sure there's lewd art of Gobots too. They were just transforming characters who happened to be female, and that's all it should be. Like, they did it right from the beginning. And they didn't push their female characters off to the side like Transformers did. You had small characters like Smallfoot and Spacey who had their own episodes and stood out. They just happened to be female characters. And then, of course, Crasher. Like, how do you not talk Gobots without talking about Crasher? I think is the best remembered character from the entire show. Not only is she female, and not only is she a main character, she's the bruiser of the bad guy team. That's pretty far ahead of its time compared to Transformers, where you got one episode with female Transformers in season 2, and then RC was thrown in as someone that no one at Hasbro or Sunbow wanted. The writers just insisted on RC existing. Gobots had a female character from Wave 1. Transformers took until about Beast Wars to get a female character on an actual retail shelf. That's just how that goes. To this day, I still put Crasher as the best female Transformer, even though she's not a female Transformer, simply because her presentation was so much better and stronger. I still wish Transformers did that well. I still wish every Mirage who came out got a Crasher remold. She deserves that. One huge thing for kids in the 80s about Gobots was affordability. So back in the day, a Gobot would run you about around $3.50, give or take depending on the retailer. And because most of the toy line was that standard Gobot size, that's really all you had to spend in order to get the major characters from the show. If you wanted Optimus Prime back in the day, you're paying $20, which for a kid in the mid 80s going on, a very, what then was a decent allowance, that would still take them like well over a month, depending on the generosity of the parents, in order to actually afford an Optimus Prime. For the cost of that Optimus Prime, they could get an entire cast of Gobots to play with. That was huge for a kid back then. Do you want one big thing, or do you want a whole bunch of things? Do you want Optimus Prime and not be able to afford anyone for him to fight for another month? Or do you want to spend a month having a war between, a 3-on-3 fight of Gobots? For a lot of kids, that's a no-brainer. You're going to want more. And it's, again, when you're talking about the advantages to Gobots on the toy shelf, variety, etc., you're going to get a lot of play value out of those, extra purchases. For the cost of Optimus Prime, you could basically buy the main cast of the show, the 3 main Renegades and the 3 main Guardians. That's pretty significant. Again, for a kid, for a kid who doesn't get a whole lot of money to throw around, that's a major difference. And back then, it took a long time for Transformers to figure out, hey, we might want to make some cost-effective versions of the main characters, because not everyone can afford that. Gobots had to figure it out from the start. And the big thing that the people at large constantly forget about this is Gobots came first. If you Google Gobots on, one of the little suggested questions that comes up is, were Gobots a ripoff of Transformers? Were Gobots knockoffs of Transformers? Did Gobots plagiarize Transformers? Because everyone thinks the winner came first, and that is not the situation here. The Gobot toys were on the toy shelves in 1983, the year before Transformers ever hit the market. The cartoon beat Transformers to the air by just less than 2 weeks, September 8th, 1984 compared to September 17th. But minor difference, but the point of the matter is, no, Gobots have never been a knockoff of Transformers. They've never been a ripoff. They've never been a copycat. They came first. They did it all first. Toy line, cartoon. I think maybe even the video game came out before the Transformers had its first game back in the Commodore 64 days. Or ZX Spectrum, whichever like super old computer console it was. Point being, Gobots was usually first on the market at everything. You can account the better quality of Transformer toys or the better quality of the cartoon as why Transformers ended up winning. They're just depicted as cooler. But, evidence and time does not lie. Gobots was never a knockoff. They were never a ripoff. For a brief little bit, for a few months in the mid-'80s, they were the only transforming game in town. If you wanted a transforming robot, you bought a Gobot, because just for a little bit, there was nothing else there. And that is going to be my list. Hopefully there's not Transformer fans angry in the comments section. This is just one man's opinion, but yeah, Gobots had a lot going for it that I think a lot of people don't think about or just don't give it credit for. It had a lot of things going for it back in the day. It just happened to be the one that lost at the end of the day. But remember it fondly. It had some good things going for it. And, it's fun to go back and look at and even to collect once in a while. So, thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comments below if you agree, disagree, and remember, hit like and subscribe so you get to find out when the next 10 random things I want to ramble about come up. I'll hope to see you then. Guys, I am facing the most powerful enemy any YouTuber can face, the algorithm, and I need your help to defeat him. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Every time you do, we attack that algorithm and we drive it back until it can no longer defeat this channel. Thank you very much.